Widely known as the most consistent series in the Godzilla franchise, the Heisei Godzilla films have been no stranger to praise or criticism. While I consider the Heisei Godzilla series overall very creative and well done, they are far from perfect films. Similar to my criticism with the Heisei Gamera films, I am going to be pointing out flaws with the characters, monsters, and plot lines in these films. Yuki's bullet is the best place to start. This weapon winds up being useless despite being built up through the entire film. The pollution message in Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla is very poorly done, with the humans saying that Space Godzilla was created by Godzilla's cells, and then the same person continues to say that if we keep polluting space, another Space Godzilla will be created. This has no connection to Space Godzilla's origins, which she is the one who explained this earlier in the film. Another problem is with the Mafia plot, which basically comes out of nowhere and also leads to nowhere. In Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, the main problem with the plot is how the plants are somehow able to make Rodan and Baby Godzilla strong. Although this isn't a huge plot point, it still serves as the reason why Rodan powers up and basically goes from one of the best to one of the worst designs in the Heisei era. The plan to control Godzilla throughout the entire Heisei era leads nowhere each time it is presented. The only time it actually does have impact is in Godzilla 1984, which ironically has nothing to do with Miki Sagusa, but with a magnetic part of Godzilla's brain that reacts to the Earth's axis. Now, in saying this, leads to some other problems. Despite the Heisei Godzilla series being extremely consistent, there are many things effective against Godzilla that are never used again, such as sound used to control Godzilla's brain, the G-Crusher which exploded Godzilla's brain, and anti-nuclear energy bacteria, which subdued Godzilla underwater for practically 2 years. Something else you could consider is the fact that cadmium was not used after Godzilla 1984, except when it was brought back in Godzilla vs. Destroya. Lines spoken by certain characters in these films are also poorly written and delivered. A few examples being Lieutenant Goro talking to Godzilla, and Miki Sagusa talking about Biollante in Godzilla vs. Biollante. The American soldiers poorly acted scenes from Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, or certain scientist scenes from Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla who have very poorly written lines. Another problem with the characters is the fact that quite a few of them just watch the monsters fight. While a lot of the characters add to the story and make the monster fights more engaging, a lot of the main characters or side characters are stuck watching the fight for the final part of the film. While this isn't as bad as characters not being smart or creating problems for themselves, like in GMK or Gamma Revenge of Iris, it still takes away from the story when you only have certain characters whose only purpose is to react to what the monsters do. And even though some of these characters don't really have much to do in these films, their motivation and position at least makes sense. That is everyone except for Emi and Miki Sagusa. First we'll start with Emi, who is one of the main reasons why people get confused about the time travel plot, despite it having an explanation in the film. Emi is the worst written character in the Godzilla franchise. She leaves the Dorats on the island solely for the reason to create King Ghidorah, while looking very guilty after being questioned by Miki about it. Emi acts surprised when the Futurians use King Ghidorah to destroy Japan, yet in the next scene she explains how she knew their plan all along, and that Godzilla was never going to destroy Japan. Now for Miki Sagusa. Her overall character is decent throughout the series, with 2 exceptions: Godzilla vs. Biollante and Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla. Both films have her do similar things, but in completely different ways. Godzilla vs. Biollante has Miki Sagusa try and control Godzilla, while looking expressionless and saying vague things. Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla also has Miki Sagusa try and control Godzilla, while having lots of expression and saying strong statements. The problem is, Miki's attempts at controlling Godzilla is that they aren't even as effective as the first controlling device shown in the Heisei Godzilla series. Miki Sagusa also has no bearing on the monsters in these 2 films, despite both films making it seem like she does. In Godzilla vs. Biollante, Miki Sagusa has the same problem Asagi and Ayana from the Heisei Gamera films have, where they say vague things that are basically pointless, confusing, and don't have an effect on the film overall. On the opposite extreme, Miki Sagusa in Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla says a lot of things aggressively to people trying to stop Godzilla, despite her literally exploding Godzilla's brain in the previous film. While this doesn't discredit her thoughts about Godzilla, it does make her character seem pointless since she doesn't even try reasonably explaining what the films show about Godzilla's character change. But a huge flaw with the Heisei Godzilla films are the miniatures. While 80% of the models are impressively accurate and well detailed, the rest are bland and lack any realism to them. The best examples of this being almost all the model buildings from Godzilla vs. Biollante, Godzilla vs. Mothra, and 1 or 2 scenes from both Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla and Destroya. The flapping of the wings, for the most part, don't look good in these films. due to the technique of slowing down the footage. It makes the flying monsters look less realistic. And the good scenes with flying monsters is faster footage, like certain scenes with Rodan and Destroya. Throughout the series, you also have quite a few poor quality miniatures and props. Main examples of this are Godzilla's head and the Super X2 in Godzilla vs. Biollante, the Dorats and King Ghidorah's flying form, Mechagodzilla's flying form, Fire Rodan's model, Space Godzilla and Mogear's flying form, the Super X3, and the Destroya minifigures. The Godzilla suits in the Heisei era are also very inconsistent. In Godzilla vs. Biollante, where this problem is at its worst, Godzilla looks completely different in each scene. This is mostly due to the animatronic, main suit, and water suit all looking completely different. While this problem got solved as the series went on, it's still a noticeable confusion in films like Godzilla 1984 and Godzilla vs. Biollante. Now the roars are something you heard talked about consistently, mostly for how the change in the roars were a bad decision. I would say the later roars are much more fitting to Godzilla and easily more iconic. The later roars do have a problem though, which is mostly notable in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. That problem being is that they are extremely repetitive and use the exact same roar multiple times in a row. But this was fixed in Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, where they used different variations of the roars, and Godzilla vs. Destroya, which uses some of the best roars and variation of the roars in the Heisei Godzilla series. Pacing is another issue, which is most notable in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 and Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla. There are times when each angle lasts more than 10 seconds and feels drawn out, especially Godzilla's beach scene and Godzilla being lifted by Space Godzilla. You also have at times unconvincing physical combat, such as Godzilla Jr.'s battle against Destroya and Godzilla's close-up fight with Mothra, while most of the other physical combat is pretty well done. Despite the reputation that the later Heisei Godzilla films gained about only having beam battles and no physical combat, Godzilla vs. Biollante, which is highly thought of by many, has the least physical combat in the entire Versus series, and uses his atomic breath more times than any other film in the franchise. Both fights against Biollante and the Super X2 are made up practically the exact same, where Godzilla shoots his atomic breath and destroys everything. In reality, films like Godzilla vs. Destroya and Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla have some of the most physical combat in the series, even when compared to certain films in the Showa era. Now, sound design is a huge part of films. Although I would say the later Heisei Godzilla film sound design is a lot better due to its realistic approach and its explosions and footsteps, there are many times when certain scenes lack proper sound effects, or they're just completely missing. There are also many scenes where the sound goes from really quiet to incredibly loud. Now, I was going to go over certain flaws in the visual effects, such as missing animations or poorly done composited scenes. But since I didn't go over that with the Heisei Gamera films, which had some of the worst animation I've ever seen, I won't go over that with these films. So overall, even with all these flaws in mind, the Heisei Godzilla series is still much better than most Godzilla films, most specifically compared to the Showa Godzilla films, and definitely the Heisei Gamera films. The Heisei Godzilla films, mostly the later part of the series, were at their best in terms of creativity and imagination. While the characters and story writing may be bland for certain films, the films themselves are not close to being bad or poorly made in any way. Even for Godzilla vs. Biollante, which is the worst of the Heisei Godzilla films, it is still much better than most Godzilla films in the Showa era or the Millennium era. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all later.